This is the video that goes over the purchase agreement. I'm not going to promise that it is the most riveting 28 minutes of your life, but it is important. Once you have an accepted contract or accepted agreement, it is a legally binding contract that everyone has to abide by. So be sure to watch it. Maybe watch the inspection section twice. Let me know what questions you have. I'm happy to go over any of it line by line. This is the Indiana purchase agreement used by all realtors in the state of Indiana. What's important here is your names and that they match how your lender has your names so that they match on the mortgage and on the deed. So if you use a middle initials, we need to put middle initials here. Section B describes the property. You'll see the street address and the legal address, and it states that that piece of property, along with any existing permanent improvements, shall be included in the sale. So that's anything that's permanently attached. We kind of use a rule of thumb. If you have to use a tool to remove it, then it's permanently attached. And we also specify here the appliances that we want left behind, or if there's anything that we want the seller to take with them that they were perhaps intending on leaving behind. This is just an additional note that says now is the time to make sure you are comfortable with square footage if that's a concern for you, what the homeowner association offers if that's a concern for you, what is included in the property. Like now is the time to make sure you're comfortable with that information. Throughout the contract, you'll see that we are creating contingencies, which are things that say, if this doesn't happen, then you as the buyer don't have to proceed, or you as the buyer have options on what you do at that point in time. So this is where one of the first contingencies pops up. We are going to put in what price you are offering the seller, and of course that's going to be negotiable. Once the original offer is made, we may go back and forth a few times. But this also creates an appraisal contingency that says if you choose to have an appraisal, and your lender is going to require you one, if you're purchasing for cash, you don't have to have an appraisal, that's up to you. But if you get an appraisal and the property does not appraise at the purchase price or higher, then you have the option of terminating the agreement, walking away, or we may try to renegotiate the price a little bit, or you may choose to just move forward. This happens sometimes when there are multiple offers and the price gets driven up a little bit. This section is about the earnest money, and that's a bit of money that you put down to show the seller that you have some investment in the property and that you're not just going to disappear, fall off the face of the earth, and they lose time on the market. So we can talk individually about what an appropriate amount is, but that has to be deposited with the listing agent within a certain number of days, and it is in their escrow account. They are not making interest off it or anything like that. It just sits there until closing, and then it comes back to you as a credit towards your closing costs or your down payment. This section continues the discussion on earnest money, talking specifically about what happens if the transaction doesn't close. How is the earnest money handled? Here we are creating our financing contingency if you are getting a mortgage. If you're paying cash, we'll check that first box, but most people are checking box number 2, which is stating that you are getting a mortgage. And so we are telling the seller how you are going to pay for the property, but we're also creating a financing contingency that says if at the end of the day you can't get this kind of mortgage with these terms that we've specified, then you can terminate the transaction. It doesn't mean you are tied to those terms. In this example, we're saying we're going to get a loan for 90% of the purchase price, so we're going to put 10% down. But if all of a sudden you realize you can put 15 or 20% down, that's fine. You can do that too. It's just creating sort of a worst case scenario of like, if I can't get this kind of financing. The 3, 4, and 5, where it says assumption, conditional sales contract, and other methods of payment, those are very rarely used. Primarily, it's either cash or mortgage, new mortgage. Due to new laws that went into effect July 1st, 2024, there were some mid-year changes to the contract. Here are a couple additions: a spot to ask for an amount of seller concessions or seller paid closing costs, and a spot to note if buyer is asking for buyer agent compensation to be paid by the seller. This section also has to do with financing, and it's basically reassuring the seller that you're not going to wait until the day before closing and then say, oh, I need to go get a mortgage today. That we are going to do our due diligence to stay on track with the timelines, and we're going to do that by applying for the mortgage right away and getting approval usually within 30 days or so. This section has to do with closing. So it specifies several things about closing. First is the date of closing. In this example, February 14th, 2024. That is the date that everyone is agreeing to close. If it needs to extend beyond that for any reason, for example, the loan is taking longer or something comes up and you're out of town, both parties have to agree to that. Otherwise, the transaction can be terminated. So this is a really important date to get on your calendar as soon as we have an accepted offer. Number 2 talks about a fee and who is paying for the closing fee. Now, this is different than the closing costs associated with your mortgage. This is just the fee that the title company charges to perform the closing, handle the monies, make sure the title is free and clear, and we typically share that equally between the buyer and the seller because both parties are using that service. It's a few $100s to each side, but again, what's important to understand is this is not your closing costs associated with getting a mortgage. Number 3 is a contingency. If you have to sell another home in order to purchase, this is where we would talk about that contingency. If there is no other home to sell first, then we would check the box that is checked here, is not contingent upon closing another transaction. And numbers 4 and 5 have to do with wiring funds. At closing, if you are to bring more than $10,000, whether that's down payment or down payment and closing costs, if that totals more than $10,000, state law requires those funds to be wired to the title company. We'll give you all that information on how to do that, so don't worry about it, but that's something you would need to do a day or two prior to closing. And then number 5 is talking about some wire fraud that has happened in the past, and so we are just warning people, hey, you want to make sure that when we give you wiring instructions that they're good. You want to call the title company, double check it. Again, this is stuff that's going to happen 30 days down the road, but just know that when we start talking about wiring, we'll have some extra instructions that we'll need to give you. This section talks about possession, so when you as the buyer get possession of the property. Sometimes it is at closing and we would check that box, and sometimes it's within a certain number of days, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days after closing. That's a negotiable item, and sometimes we offer a little bit of possession after closing. If that's appealing to the seller, it can certainly help and offer rise to the top if there are multiple offers. Number 2 here talks about the maintenance of the property, which is that the seller is required to maintain the property in its present condition. So if something breaks or something gets damaged, they are supposed to fix it. You have the right to expect that the property be in about the same condition. Now, obviously, when you move furniture out, there are dust bunnies and things like that. There is no legal requirement in terms of cleaning. So I always tell my clients, just expect to give the house a good cleaning before you move in. The sellers are required to remove all debris and any personal property prior to possession. Number 3 talks about casualty loss, which is if something bigger happens, like a tornado comes through and takes off the roof, then you have the right to either terminate the agreement, or you may choose to close the transaction, but working with the seller's insurance company to make sure that repairs get made to your advantage. I have a good story about that if you're ever curious. Number 4, utilities are the seller's responsibility through the date of possession. And number 5 is about home heating fuel. So if you're purchasing a property that has a propane tank and there is propane left in the tank, how that is to be handled. This section only applies if you are buying an investment property or property that is currently rented with tenants in a lease. So let me know if that is the case and we will talk about it. This section talks about if you're going to ask the seller to provide a survey. Typically, surveys are waived unless they're large pieces of property or we have concerns about a neighboring fence or building that is encroaching over the property line of the property you're intending on buying. So if you have concerns about a survey, let's talk about it and see if it makes sense or if there are other ways to satisfy your concerns. This section covers a couple of different things. One, it creates a contingency that if the property ends up being in a floodplain, you could cancel the agreement if it requires flood insurance. We probably already know that, but just in case something weird comes up, it's an extra layer of protection. It also discloses whether you're using the property as owner occupied or an investment property, and also creates a contingency of your ability to get homeowners insurance on the property. This section is one of several that strongly encourages you to seek expert opinions if you have any concerns about environmental contaminants, lead-based paint, radon, mold, that kind of thing. We just want you to seek out the experts who can answer your questions. The next section of the contract talks about inspections, and there's quite a bit here, so we're going to split it up into a couple of chunks. So the first section is, are you going to do an inspection? So there's 3 options here. One is waiving the inspection. I don't recommend that, except in very specific cases, and it's not something that's typically done in our area. Number 2 is that you reserve the right to have independent inspections. So you hire the home inspector, I help you, give you references, all that sort of thing. And then the seller agrees to have all the utilities on for inspections. And then the third is that the property is sold as is, which means you have the right to do inspections, but then your options are you either move forward with the purchase or you walk away. There is no negotiating on repairs. So most people, we end up checking box 2, that you reserve the right to have independent inspections. This next section about inspections talks about the timeline. So we put in a number of days. It's usually 14 or 15 days or so. My job is to keep track of timelines, so I will make sure that you are doing what you need to be doing when you need to be doing it. So I keep track of all those timelines. So in this case, we put in 14 days to do inspections. The scope of the inspection, which is letter B here, is all of the things that you are reserving the right to have inspected. And that's the heating and the cooling and the attic and the roof and the walls and the outlets and the septic, if there's a septic, and the crawl space. I mean, it's pretty much everything. Section letter C says that if we run out of time doing inspections, you have your full inspection done within your 14 days, and then we need some additional, sometimes we need a contractor to come out and look at something additional, that we have the right to ask for a few additional days to do that. And then D is stating that if you do not make a response to inspections, if you don't ask the seller to make any repairs or any kind of written response to the seller within that 14-day timeline, then you accept the property and you move forward to closing. So it's real important that we stick to our timelines here and understand what those timelines are. Again, that's my responsibility, so don't stress too much about that. We'll make sure that we stay on top of all of that. This next section is my favorite section about inspections because I think it is the most misunderstood. So maybe play this one twice for me. Thanks. All right. Letter E, if a defect is defined during an inspection, then your obligation as a buyer is to provide the inspection report or the pages that have to do with that defect if the defect is something that you're concerned about. You may just be like, I don't think that's a big deal. I'm not worried about it. Move forward. That happens a lot. But if it is something that you are worried about, you have to A, show the seller what the defect is in the report, and B, give the seller an opportunity to remedy the defect. That means you can't just walk away at that point. You have to give the seller a chance to remedy it to your satisfaction, which is kind of how we protect you. You have to be satisfied with however it's fixed, but you have to give the seller a chance. You can't just walk away. That's a little bit different in other real estate markets. They have a period where the buyer can walk away for any reason at all. That is not how we do things around here. The next part of that is that the seller then, once you make those requests to the seller, if they are unable or unwilling to remedy the defect to your satisfaction, that's when you can walk away. So it's not until you give them a chance. Now, next one, G, is what is a defect? We've said that if a major defect comes up and it's something you as the buyer are not comfortable with, you have to give the seller a chance to remedy it. But what is a defect? This basically states that a defect is defined as a health and safety hazard, or if not repaired, would shorten the lifespan of the home. So health and safety hazard could be like a carbon monoxide leak. The second part to that is if not repaired. So think about like a hole in the roof where water is coming in, damaging the wood. That's going to cause the home to become uninhabitable sooner than it should. And so those are the kinds of things we're looking for. So if you think about it, a hole in a window screen probably doesn't meet that definition of a major defect. But again, a hole in a roof, a foundation issue, an electrical issue that's a safety hazard, those are all things that meet that definition of a defect. Now, if the sellers have previously disclosed something on their seller's disclosure, we'll get to that here in just a minute, then that is something that you are not able to ask for in an inspection response because you made the offer with the knowledge that something was not functioning or something was a problem. And then I is just one of these hold harmless that, I'm not a contractor and consult attorneys and that. This section indicates whether you are asking the seller to provide you with a home warranty. If we've not had that conversation about what a home warranty is, hit me up and we can talk about it. There are pros and cons to it, so it may be something we need to think about how it fits into your offer package. In the state of Indiana, there are a couple disclosures that may be required, not always, but may be required. And so I've included a copy here. This is the first one. This is the residential seller's disclosure. It is required in most sales in the state of Indiana. It is not intended to substitute for an inspection. It is simply the seller stating what is and isn't included and if there are any known defects. But you have to remember that they are not contractors like you or I, not contractors, and most homeowners are not up on their roof or in their crawl space looking at it with a contractor's eye. So just because there are no defects noted doesn't mean that there aren't any, things with the home that need to be addressed. It just means they're not aware of any. If they are aware of something, then you need to make the offer with that knowledge in mind because you can't come back later and ask the seller to fix something that has been disclosed up front. If a home was built prior to 1978, then there would be also a lead-based paint disclosure, which would just be the seller stating if they'd ever had the home tested for lead-based paint, which most of the time they have not. But that's only for homes built prior to 1978. Section R is all things title, which is probably not something that is front of mind for you, but it is important. So let us guide you through this. We are asking the seller to provide a title insurance policy. That is just ensuring that the property is free and clear of any back taxes or any liens or anyone else staking claim to any of it. And if there were an issue down the road, 3, 5, 10 years, and you still own the property, then you could file a claim with the insurance company and they would cover costs to help get it taken care of. I will say that in over 900 transactions, I've had one client come close to having to file a title insurance claim, but we were able to get that resolved. So it's not anything that would it doesn't typically come up, but if it does, or if it did, you would want that insurance because you don't want to lose the property or lose all the money you have put into the property. So it is important we ask the seller to provide the owner's title insurance policy, which covers you for the up to the entire purchase price or value of the property. There is a secondary title insurance policy if you have a mortgage, which is called the lender's title insurance policy. It provides them some insurance in case they were to be out of pocket because they have a financial stake in that property being free and clear as well. And then we also state here if the buyer or the seller selects the title insurance. Again, that's usually something that happens behind the scenes, but if you do have a very specific wish to work with a certain title company, let us know when we can help with that. This next section talks about how property taxes are going to be handled during the sale. It is very, very confusing, so you will not be tested on this. Maybe just kind of know that you understood it at one point of time, but you can kind of let it leave your head. That is okay too. There are a few options, but I would say that 999 times out of 1,000, we are checking box number 2, which is that any unpaid taxes, you are either being given a credit for or they are getting paid at closing. But I've got a chart on the next slide that we'll go over that explains property taxes a little bit better. This is why property taxes are a little bit confusing. And again, every area and every state is a little bit different in how this is handled. In Indiana, we pay our property taxes in arrears, which means that the year passes and then the property tax bill comes due the following year. So the property tax bills that are due in 2024 actually cover the year 2023. So where it gets tricky is because 2023, you didn't own the home. So you shouldn't have to pay the property tax bill that covers that time period. It's like paying someone else's water bill from a month before you own the home. So this chart sort of shows, and you can refer back to it, how we kind of work out credits where when was the property tax bill due? What time period does it cover? Did you own the home during that time period? And if there's a time period that is split, there's a tax bill that covers 6 months and half of it the previous owner owned the home and half of it you will have owned the home, then we prorate property taxes. That comes to you as a credit. If you want to talk more about that and get real specific on what the numbers look like for your specific situation, because it's based on closing date, we can have that conversation. Just let me know. The next section, I've got a couple of sections on this slide. Prorations and special assessments just means that if there are any assessments from the homeowner association or anything like property taxes that are going to be prorated, it talks about how that proration is calculated. It doesn't come into effect too much. And section U about time is of the essence, that's really important. That is a standard clause in most contracts that says all contracts have time periods within them and we all agree to stick to them. What's important to understand here is that the seller and the buyer have the right to withdraw any offer or a counteroffer prior to written acceptance and delivery of that. So what that means is that you make an offer and you give the seller a day or so to think about that offer. You can withdraw that at any time until they respond back with an acceptance. So you can back out an hour later and be like, oh, nope, I've changed my mind. But likewise, if the seller counters back to you, so you make an offer and then the seller gives you a counteroffer and says, oh, you can take a couple days to think about it, they can withdraw that counteroffer at any time, especially if they get another offer that's better than yours and they can go work with that other offer and you are left out in the cold. So let me know if you want me to explain that, because that's real important. I've had a couple of buyers years ago not really understand that and kind of get burned because I think, oh, I've got 2 days to think about how I want to respond to this offer. And meanwhile, someone else came along, made an offer, and the seller withdrew the counter offer and left the buyers out in the cold. So just make decisions as quickly as you're comfortable making them. That is a real important today's market. If you are purchasing a property that is in a homeowner association, then this section talks about when you would receive the homeowner association documents and how much time you would have to review them before moving forward. The attorney fees section states that if this contract has to be enforced in a court of law, that the losing party pays the winning party's attorney fees. And the fair housing section goes over the Fair Housing Act that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. This last section just covers a lot of odds and ends, important stuff, but odds and ends that don't really fit anywhere else. And you can read through it. Feel free to ask me any questions you have. Just sort of the highlights. The first few, there is information about meth lab registry, sex offender registry, if you have any concerns about that. Also, it says that any electronic signatures, we all agree that those are acceptable and that documents can be delivered via email, and we all agree that that is acceptable as well. Highlights of these next few provisions. Number 11, this is legalese. It's kind of hard to understand sometimes. All rights, duties, and obligations shall survive, which means that, as an example, if the sellers have agreed to do a repair and it doesn't get done properly, or you find out after closing it wasn't done, the seller still has the obligation to do that. Just because you signed closing documents, it doesn't free the seller from the things that they had agreed to do. And number 12 is stating that I may refer people to you. I will give you suggestions for home inspectors or lenders or insurance companies, title companies, et cetera, et cetera. I don't get kickbacks from any of those. I don't make anything off of those. I just am giving you referrals based on my experience and knowing who will provide you the best service, but you are free to use whoever you want. And this last part just acknowledges that you've received a copy of the purchase agreement once we have it signed, that you agree to receive communication via phone, mail, email, text message, fax, if anybody still has a fax machine still in there, that you do or do not have an Indiana real estate license, some things like that. All right, we are almost there. I hope you're still with me. Further conditions. This is an area where we can put in any kind of language for anything specific to this transaction that doesn't fit anywhere else. I do like to put in language if we are asking the seller to help cover your loan closing costs, because I like to put all these words in there to make sure that every penny of what we ask for is used if they agree to that. But other things we may put in there, there are some techniques that we use sometimes if there are multiple offers, stating that we're not going to be super picky on inspections. That might go in here. I once had to negotiate some Michael Jordan posters, and that went in here, and then the lender didn't like that. But so if there's anything extra in here that we need to, throw into the contract, we would put that in there. This section just talks about another opportunity to say if you have legal questions or need tax advice, consult the professionals in that field, and also acknowledges if this is or is not a limited agency transaction, meaning how many realtors are involved. Do you have your own representation, or are you and the seller using the same realtor represent you both? This is where we put how long we are giving the seller to respond to our offer. And also legal remedies. That section talks about if the buyer fails or refuses to close the transaction, that the seller does have legal recourse. And in that case, I would probably be encouraging you to seek legal counsel. And this is where you sign. Once the seller has reviewed the offer, they can either accept it, they can reject it, or they can counter it. So they would mark that box, sign here, and then if they were countering, they would send over a separate document, a counter offer with their new terms that they're suggesting.